Hello and welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. Today's video is about risk and diversification. There's no mini exercise associated with this video, but I'm excited about it because in this video we'll look at one of my favorite graphs in the whole course. It's hard to choose one favorite because there's so many good ones, right? But let's get into it. So we'll be working off the Chapter 6 PowerPoint, and in this video we'll cover slides 15 through 21. All right. So just a little bit of recap from what we discussed before spring break. We saw for three different kinds of investments: short-term treasury bills, right, short-term government bonds, and then longer-term government bonds and stocks. We saw historical returns going back 90 years, and we saw some pretty compelling graphical evidence that the riskiest kind of investment, large cap stocks, the S&P 500, had the highest, grew the most on average, right? Even though the most negative returns came from large cap stocks, the S&P 500, historically, they grow by far the most, right? So big takeaway from last week before spring break. Risky investments tend to have higher average returns, right? And this page quantifies that. The average annual return for the S&P 500 is 11.7% per year. That doesn't happen every year, right? It won't happen this year. This is going to be a bad year for stocks, I'm sure. But on average, 11.7% return. Right? Compare that to the least risky investment we can find that never lost money in our sample, short-term T-bills, average return of 3.3%. So we call T-bills the risk-free investment. And the extra return that one earns by buying into like a risky investment like stocks over a risk-free investment, right? That extra return is called a risk premium. So the difference between the average return on large cap stocks and a risk-free investment, T-bills, that 8.4% is called a risk premium. We'll end up using a risk premium later in the chapter. So one way to minimize risk is by diversification. That's the thrust of this chapter, of this talk today, this video. And so a portfolio's return is a weighted average of the individual stocks' returns. If I had two stocks, right, if I had a portfolio of two stocks, the return for that portfolio would just be a weighted average of the two individual stocks. And then you can work out this example on your own. And the result, the math is in the notes section of the slide. But here's the weights, right? 0.6 and 0.4, I would decimalize those. And then the returns, decimalize these. Right? Portfolios like this would have a return that's equal to, here's the weight in stock A times stock A's return. And then here's the weight in stock B, stock Zappa times stock Zappa's return. Computing a portfolio return hopefully is pretty straightforward. Talk to me offline about it if you want to go over it in more detail. I'd be happy to. So a portfolio's return is a weighted average of the individual stocks' returns. But the interesting thing is that a portfolio's level of risk, its standard deviation, is actually less than a weighted average of the individual stock standard deviations. We can see this graphically right here. Right? Here's a two-stock portfolio with Ford, auto manufacturer, and then some company called Newmont Mining, right? And then you can see the green line is the return for a portfolio of these two stocks. And you see the highs aren't as high and the lows aren't as low for the portfolio compared to the individual stocks. What's happening is the company specific, good things at Newmont Mining kind of offset the company specific bad things at Ford. And that's the effect of diversification, right? And so to understand diversification, we have to talk about two different kinds of risk, actually, two categories of risk. There are some risks that affect just one firm. That's company unique risk, right? And then there are some things that affect all firms. That's called market risk. So let's differentiate between those two. Examples of company unique risk, right? If I was writing out things on the board in an in-person class, I'd write, these kind of things. Company unique risk, some examples. Right? So if a CEO gets sick or passes away, that's a negative event that affects one firm, right? Or if we have a manufacturing firm and there's a fire at the manufacturing plant, right? That's a highly negative event that affects just one firm. So those are company unique risks. Contrast that with market risk, right? Market risk or systematic or non-diversifiable risk. Examples of market risk include, macro factors like recession affects all firms negatively, right? Pandemic affects a lot of firms, highly negative event, right? Pretty much all firms are negatively affected by the pandemic. And then something like, any macro things like inflation, changes in unemployment, things that negatively affect all companies to a certain extent, right? So there's a continuum. There's some risks that affect some firms, right? But the main thing is if we differentiate between company unique risk, just one firm, and then a market-wide risk that affects all firms, hopefully you can see the difference. And diversification, having more than one investment in your portfolio, eliminates those company unique risks. If I have just one stock, it's a manufacturing firm, and then that firm's plant burns down, then my portfolio suffers tremendously, right? But if I own a lot of different stocks, a lot of different investments, and the plant for one of my investments burns down, that's bad news, right? But it's the effect of that is minimized because I've got lots of other stocks in my portfolio. So here's my favorite graph that illustrates that. On the x-axis is the size of the portfolio, how many stocks there are in the portfolio. On the x-axis is the portfolio's risk, right? Its standard deviation. And so as you add stocks to a portfolio, its risk declines. So if we don't like risk, and investors don't, if we don't like risk overall, having a diversified portfolio is better because it reduces risk. And what's happening is, those negative company unique events are becoming immaterial, or they offset each other, right? As we have a diversified portfolio. So key takeaway, diversification eliminates company unique risk, right? What's not eliminated is market risk. We can see that a portfolio's risk doesn't go to zero, but because no matter how many stocks you have in a portfolio, there's still market risk, right? The portfolio is still full of stocks, and all stocks respond negatively to things like recessions and unemployment and things like that. So diversification eliminates company unique risk, right? And so our first risk measure that we have so far, standard deviation, it captures total variation in an investment's returns. And so, stocks vary over time because of market-wide factors and also because of company unique factors. Standard deviation captures all of that. Okay, so standard deviation, total risk, captures market risk plus unique risk, right? In the next video, we're going to look at a risk measure specific to market risk, because this is the kind of risk that I can't eliminate through diversification. So I want to focus on measuring this carefully. And that's what the next video is about. So thanks for sticking with me on this one, and we'll see you at the next video. Nice work.